Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. We have a plethora of issues to cover today, and not all of them necessarily warrant a whole show, but all of them are important and are interesting. We're going to talk about Alberta's lifting of COVID measures. We're going to discuss the new CDC numbers concerning adverse effects for children from the COVID vaccine. Also, the Ontario Nurses Association, which is pushing for making vaccines mandatory for staff. And switching away from COVID, we're going to discuss some good things, too. Some of the highlights and controversies, perhaps, at the Tokyo Games, one surrounding a Belarusian defector, and the other of two high jumpers choosing to share the gold medal and the podium. Well, joining me today is David Clement, North American Affairs Manager of Consumer Choice Center. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me back.
You're always fun to banter with, and I think we have many controversial issues, some which may appear uncontroversial, like this. Well, maybe we'll start with the Russian, the Italian and Qatari men's high jump. So, for those who did not catch this, for the final high jumper round, if you will, at the Tokyo Games, an Italian and Qatari high jumper were battling it out for the gold. And these two are both friends and competitors. And they essentially were pretty much in a deadlock. They were tied. And something exciting happened. Why don't you share with us what happened?
Yeah, basically what happened is they were both tied at the same height and in regards to the amount of attempts that they had had. And it was put to them in terms of whether or not they wanted to go to a jump off or not, or whether they would essentially have two gold medals, no silver, and a bronze. And they decided to share the gold medal. And the video from it is actually quite incredible because you see the moment, especially the Italian athlete, kind of realize his dream, which is always fun to see. I mean, that's part of the reason why we love the Olympics, is we get to see people live their dream and achieve something that you spend a lifetime competing for. So I thought it was a great moment. I know some people like Piers Morgan disagreed, but I thought it was a special moment, one of the highlights so far.
Well, we'll talk about that disagreement, but I too was quite moved by the visuals of these two men just jumping into each other's arms, full of joy that they've both achieved their dream. And the Italian, I believe this was his last competitive event. He was going to retire. So to go out on a gold, achieving his dream is such a huge thing. But I watched the dialogue between them and the official, and they said, well, it was kind of like an ad hoc settlement. I've never seen this happen in the Olympics, where we're going to have a discussion as to how we're going to settle this issue. And essentially, you, the athlete, get to decide. And there was pushback. You're right. Piers Morgan put out an op-ed on this. I've seen a lot of people in the Twitter sphere complaining, saying, but it's the Olympics. The whole point is to find out who is the best. So they should have, like in sudden death in hockey or with a shootout in football, I mean, nobody likes those events, but ultimately when it comes down to a shootout, nobody likes that. But ultimately we have to pick one. So why can't they just pick one?
So, I mean, I don't think we ultimately have to pick one. Any Canadian who has followed figure skating knows of David Pelletier and Jamie Salé. They split a gold medal. That was a moment of pride for us. So those who are complaining probably need to reconsider that important fact. But I mean, in regards to Piers Morgan, he makes a living off of being an insufferable loser.
But I saw average Canadians on Twitter echoing the same sentiment. So I'm not going to dust it off as just Piers. Like people were, like normal Canadians say, hey, you know what? But there should really be only one winner.
Well, I would agree with you if there was some uncomfortable trend of settling. But I mean, I don't think that this has happened for over 70 years where something like this has happened. So it's incredibly rare. The system is set up to avoid ties, and it just so happened in this moment. So I don't really have an issue with it. It is also important to factor in that we're talking about incredible circumstances in regards to the heat.
Right.
Anyone who, if you see the temperature reading and the humidity in the stadium on any given day, you're looking at 33, 35 degrees, 90% humidity. So I can understand why there would be an agreement there. In the same way that in theory, in any speed sport, you can have a tie. You can have in speed skating, in running, It's less likely because they go to the thousandth of a second,
It's
but it's
true.
possible. And you would give 2 gold medals because they were tied.
Okay.
And so I would say that it's incredibly uncommon, and it's really not something people should worry about.
Welcome back. We're firing through some current issues that are happening, and we just wrapped up one interesting one at the Tokyo Games. We're going to talk about another one at the Tokyo Games. David, did you catch this? There was a Belarusian track and field athlete, a female athlete, and she, I guess, caught herself in hot water with her government, and that's, to put it very lightly, criticizing the coaching staff and the management staff of their track and field team. And I guess that was met with complete hostility from her home government, to the point where they were trying to force her on an airplane, allegedly force her on an airplane from Japan. Board this plane, get back to your country because we're going to deal with you there. That's what I read. Well, she said, forget it. I'm not going. She refused to board the plane at the airport and basically is seeking refuge. Now, the latest news is that Poland has stepped in and that they will be offering her a visa so she won't have to be repatriated. Why is this such a big deal? I mean, it's not the first time we've seen defectors, if you will, but I don't think she was intending to defect. It kind of just happened at the Games.
So, I mean, this is important. First off, kudos to Japan for resisting. And I think Poland deserves an incredible amount of praise here as well. What we have with Belarus is a country that's essentially mirroring the Putin playbook in terms of how they treat dissidents, journalists. It wasn't long ago that they interceded a flight not bound for Belarus, forced it to land in Belarus to jail a journalist. There's stories of I believe this week of a Belarusian activist in Ukraine found dead in his home. He was well known for essentially founding an NGO that helps Belarusians flee persecution. So we have a regime that's mirroring the Putin playbook. So I think it's great to see Poland put their foot down here, because, I mean, the Polish people know exactly what it's like to live under a dictatorship, and they're standing up to what is now widely regarded as Europe's last dictator.
Yes, and again, I agree with you. Kudos to Poland for stepping in there. You mentioned Russia. I believe it was at the Olympic Games. Remember Mikhail Baryshnikov? He was another famous gymnast. He was a gymnast, a defector. Or no, he was a ballet, my apologies, not gymnast. But yeah, anyhow, so these things happen at the Games. Yes, you're right. I'm glad to see how Japan responded there. I think they responded well, and the other countries coming to be. It's strange in some ways. We have this thriving democracy here on this side of the ocean, but
also, can you imagine living in a country where criticizing your coach could put you in hot water with your criminal justice system? Just for viewers, think about living in a country where you have to be so self-censored that you can't openly disagree with a coaching decision.
Yeah, it's absurd.
Just terrible, horrific circumstances. And unfortunately, it's all too common in Belarus.
Well, perhaps she's just stepped into becoming the biggest ambassador for democracy globally for her country. So we'll see what happens there. A couple things happening. We saw a new CDC report about children's adverse effects from the Pfizer vaccine. Again, this is from the Center for Disease Control in America. They're saying 397 children, so almost 400, have suffered heart inflammation, the condition known as myocarditis. It's quite serious. These are young children, obviously ages 12 plus, but under 18. This is not something people want. This is not something nobody wants their child to have, and it has been reported by the CDC through their vaccine reporting system. Now, just to keep it clear that to date, keep in mind that total deaths for U.S. kids now ages 5 to 18 is 282. How do you square this?
Well, I think that deaths is probably the wrong way to look at it. Serious illness is probably the more comparable figure. And we know from the UK, I think there are about 33,000 children in the United Kingdom who are experiencing what we call long COVID. So long lingering effects. So it's important to weigh that. I think that when we compare just deaths, in the same way that when we compare just cases, we distort a lot of the nuance in the conversation. And so I think it's important to weigh that in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, especially when we have the increased prevalence of variants and how that will progress. And so it's important also to point out that with that in mind, the CDC still stuck by its recommendation that the cost-benefit analysis is clearly and overwhelmingly on the side of the vaccine. And so it's unfortunate that there are instances of severe side effects. They're incredibly rare in terms of the millions of youth who have been given the vaccine. But the cost-benefit analysis is still pretty clearly on the side of getting the vaccine.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on a plethora of current issues. We talked about a whole host of things, including Olympics and the CDC latest data on youth with myocarditis and children. Let's talk about Ontario for a moment. And this is sort of probably being echoed in many provinces in Canada and territories. But the Ontario Nurses Association, so that's a professional association that governs nurses in Ontario, is calling for the mandatory vaccination that all workers be vaccinated, for all healthcare workers. There are concerns. Right now, it's optional. The flu shot is optional even, but now they're saying no, for the COVID vaccine, it ought to be mandatory, and they're calling on the government, I guess, to enforce that. What are your thoughts on that, David?
So I generally think that this is an appropriate response. I mean, we're talking about people who are dealing with the most vulnerable. We're talking about people who are sick, who may have compromised immune systems, and the nurses themselves are obviously the most likely to be exposed to COVID. So I don't think that it's unreasonable. I do have some questions as to whether or not the Nurses Association has the ability to make this call themselves and say, hey, it's a requirement as being part of the union and your employment. I'm not sure. I don't know the logistics as to why they're pivoting to the province. We've certainly seen this discussion start to play out in regards to teachers and what happens with teachers. But for nurses, given the circumstances of where they're working, I certainly think it's appropriate just by virtue of the vulnerable whom they are caring for and the fact that that's where people with COVID go. So it's not an unrelated profession where maybe people are being too cautious at the expense of kind of that personal choice. So yeah, I do think it's appropriate in this scenario.
Okay, I have concerns about this. This is not PPE, this is not masking, this is something you're injecting into your body. So once it's there, it's there. And, obviously, people have to take charge of their own healthcare decisions. Nurses do that on a daily basis for helping others make those decisions. Why not themselves? My concern is, are we now overstepping civil liberties? Are we now saying, well, that your personal freedom to manage your own health care and choose which treatments you will or will not take is now out of your hands? Your professional body saying, you got to do this, you got to do it. And to your point about why this is now, they're calling on the province to kind of get involved, is because I think they realize that this probably won't withstand a legal challenge. Recently, a few years ago, there was a BC court case where a nurse refused to take the flu shot, the annual flu shot, and she won that case. So now no longer is that mandatory, at least in British Columbia, that nurses have to take that flu shot. There are other protocols for that time, and I believe in many environments in Ontario, definitely that exists as well. But again, coming back to my original point, where is the personal freedom, the personal autonomy to handle your own health care? I get the point. Yes, you're in LTCs, you're you're dealing with a vulnerable population in a sometimes a very vulnerable setting. That aside, there's very conflicted data saying whether being vaccinated stops transmission or not. We've seen numbers out of the US that puts it almost at 50-50.
So I disagree with you on your last point, because the data shows in regards to the ability for vaccinated people to transmit the disease. So you have to be a breakthrough case based on the CDC data, which is the largest data set ever created. We're looking at a 0.003% chance of being a breakthrough case. If you are a breakthrough case, then you can transmit the virus. That is real and that exists. And there's not much we can do about that. But that is extremely rare. So we're not talking, the efficacy isn't the issue here. The issue is that in particular the media, has very poorly communicated the information in regards to the relative risk and what the vaccine does in terms of protection. In regards to whether or not you get to make your own decisions for your personal health care, it's, I think, one step further than that. It's, do you get to make your own personal decisions in regards to your health care and stay employed at the place you're currently employed? Because nobody is advocating that everyone by force needs to get the vaccine. I haven't heard anyone suggest that.
I think this is where they're suggesting to make it mandatory. So if it's mandatory, it will be essentially do it or you lose your job.
Yes.
That's very coercive.
Well, I mean, yes, but I mean, that's more a per se problem of who is managing healthcare. If we were talking about private hospitals or dental clinics, I don't think most people would say, okay, well, it's the business's right to decide that for their employees. So there is a difference between private and public employees, but that's just because our healthcare system is, for the most part, entirely public, and it certainly is for nurses. So I'm not convinced by the argument that this is taking away their ability to make medical choices for themselves.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our show on current issues, and the last one, which to me was quite surprising when I saw this in the news, was that Alberta, under the governance of Premier Jason Kenney, is going to be lifting pretty much all COVID restrictions come mid-August. This surprised me. This seems like a complete 180 from where the province was. Now, I know that they lifted the lockdown in June. They've enjoyed a very nice, or I guess it was June 1st or July 1st, they enjoyed a very nice time at the Calgary Stampede. I think there haven't been a huge surge in cases with all that social gathering. But now Alberta's going to lift. They're saying, you know what, we're going to learn to live with COVID. I was pleasantly surprised. I think, for once, we're not having a government preaching fear, and that there actually may be some light at the end of this tunnel. Am I alone in this, David, or do you agree with me?
No, I think it was generally a good move by Kenney. I appreciated his comment where he said that caseloads don't necessarily equate to hospitalizations. And that's kind of like the adult in the room conversation that a lot of people have wanted to have happen for months now. I would say probably going back to November through January of November of last year through January of this year. So I think that it's the right move. I mean, politically, I don't think Kenney has the political capital to not do this. I mean, he's taken a beating with COVID. There's just not, he doesn't have the social license to continue down the road of heavy restrictions.
Which is strange because for most politicians in this country, perhaps even the world, it seems like COVID has given them such a boost in the polls. Maybe Alberta's an anomaly in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, the political culture there is, it's a little more like Texas or Montana rather than California or New York.
Or Ontario.
But I would also say that I appreciate it because I think it's incredibly problematic to continue to heavily restrict the vaccinated, given how unlikely they are to be a breakthrough case and contribute to the continued spread of the virus. And so I think I appreciate his approach. You have to balance hospitalizations because nobody wants to go back into a scenario where you're delaying important surgeries. I know in Ontario, hundreds of people died waiting for very important surgeries. And I think that that's unacceptable. I know that people have issues getting access to things like annual physicals, which is completely unacceptable and going to have disastrous consequences. So I think that this is a step in the right direction, despite the fact that a lot of people are kind of beating the fear drum, saying that Alberta is going to really regress here.
Well, if we look to British Columbia, which seems to now sort of being heading into a little bit more of a restrictive realm, or at least, I don't know, I seem to say they're playing a little bit more into the COVID. I mean, Bonnie Henry never closed down a day of school in the last school year. That's the British Columbia medical officer, chief medical officer of health. They never closed down their schools. The rest of the country pretty much did. They were the only jurisdiction, I believe, where they didn't. And, people are now up in arms saying, well, Jason Kenney's plans to lift all COVID restrictions are going to have negative impact in the classrooms if kids aren't masking. But again, we've talked about this on the show. There seems to be very little transmission within schools. I mean, those are statistics, those are stats. Why penalize the population further? People seem to be, taking these measures seriously. I think you're going to have a lot of people who still will socially distance, who will still choose to wear the mask. And by all means, that's your personal choice. I remember putting on a mask at the very early days of COVID to be told by a nurse in a hospital to take it off. Why was I wearing one?
I was in the exact same boat. I looked at what was going on in Taiwan while our own public health officials were saying, don't buy masks, they're not useful. I was wearing a mask because, it was pretty obvious what was working in Taiwan. And so, so long as they balance hospitalizations as the deciding factor of what to do next,
right?
I think that's the way you avoid disaster. Most of the people I've seen who are really fearful use caseload as their metric, and that's not a very good way to measure what public policy should be, especially as vaccination rates hit 65, 68, 70, 80%. And so I definitely think that this is the right way to go.
Okay, last 10 seconds. Do you think he's going to be able to hold it, or do you think he's going to do another 180?
I hope he's able to hold it, and I hope he's able to hold it because hospitalizations stay flat or manageable.
Okay, well, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us, David. Always a pleasure to speak.
Thank you very much.
Lots of discussion there, and at times very different perspectives on our current events here in Canada. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.